This is how you know your glucose is high at night. Now, you don't have to be insulin resistant, you don't have to be diabetic for this to happen, which is exactly why I wanted to do this video. Because perhaps you're dealing with insulin resistance in a small scale or in its early stages and you're just noticing it happening at night. Because during the day, you have insulin independent means of reducing your glucose. You're walking around, so the muscles are sucking up glucose. Then all of a sudden you're laying down, you're dormant, you're in bed, right? So your glucose can go up quite a bit higher and you're not recognizing it. So it's a good place to kind of start when you're looking at, do I have insulin resistance or what's going on? But I don't want you to freak out. If you have high glucose at night, there's a number of different reasons this could be happening. So I'm gonna list those off first before we get into the symptoms that you might feel. So first off, if you're eating too close to bed, this will definitely do it. Drive up that glucose at night. If you had lower glycemic, starchier carbs, although healthier, sometimes there's a delayed response. So they don't spike until after you go to bed when you lay down. So that could cause high glucose at night. If you're sick or you have an injury, this triggers a hypermetabolic effect that can definitely cause this to happen. If you didn't exercise as much that particular day, maybe you normally run 5 miles every day and today you didn't, it's causing excess glucose to be in your bloodstream. If you're on your period, progesterone, that's going to decrease insulin, so glucose levels are going to be higher, and then of course stress and cortisol. So now that we know there are reasons outside of being diabetic or insulin resistant, let's go ahead and talk about what you might feel. If you're running to the toilet a bunch in the middle of the night, like 2 times, 3 times, 6 times, what ends up happening is when you have higher amounts of glucose, especially higher amounts of glucose than your body's used to, the kidneys do whatever they can to expel the extra glucose by forcing you to go pee, right? So it creates fluid from other tissues or takes fluid from other tissues and forces you to pee to get that extra glucose out. This becomes worse and worse the more that it's sort of an anomaly because the body's sort of like shocked by all this glucose and it tries to get rid of it. So it's an early sign if you're starting to find that like, hey, I'm incrementally peeing more and more and more as time goes on. The next one is you're waking up a lot. Now this is very vague. There's a lot of reasons why we might wake up a lot. But there is some interesting data. There was a study that took a look at type 1 diabetics. Now, I know you're not a type 1 diabetic more than likely because it's a pretty small number of people that are, but this is still very, very relevant because that's not really what it's looking at. It's looking at the glucose response. They took a look at subjects and they found that on the weekends, they had much more awakenings at night. They were waking up all the time, but during the week they weren't. And then when they cross-referenced and they looked at their diet, they realized their diets were very different on the weekends. They were consuming more sugar, more carbohydrates, and this obviously pooled up. And what do you know? They ended up having more awakenings. There's a simple reason to this, right? It's like when your glucose levels are higher, your body creates more adrenaline, more cortisol as a response to deal with it because it sees it as glucose is going high. A, it's a stressful situation. B, from a fundamental side of things, we want to go burn it. The body wants you to burn it. And cortisol, so then all of a sudden you have this stress response, they pile on top of each other, forces you to wake up because that adrenaline's like, hey, wake up, there's an emergency. It can definitely be problematic. Now, if you're not a diabetic, this can still happen. Like if you ate a pie before bed, watch, you'll probably wake up a bunch. It just happens that way because these glucose undulations are causing this adrenaline response. Now, I would recommend, if you have the ability to use a continuous glucose monitor so that you can maybe watch what's happening at night when you get up in the morning. Because unfortunately, you can't get up in the middle of the night unless you sleepwalk and prick your finger. But if you look at a continuous glucose monitor, you can kind of see what's happening. Like I tend to see when I go to bed, for about an hour afterwards, my glucose goes up because I'm active. I'm a very active person. Then all of a sudden, boom, I'm down. My glucose goes up because all of a sudden there's not muscles to suck it up because I'm not moving. I put a link down below for a company called Signos. They allow you to get a continuous glucose monitor. They are a sponsor on this channel, full disclaimer, but I definitely recommend it. I think it's worth it. And that allows you to get a continuous glucose monitor, but then also it's a really cool technology that almost has this predictive valuing in some ways. So it can look at what you're eating, sees your glucose going up, and it will give you warnings and say, hey, you should go out for a walk, or you should go do something to bring your glucose down. Really cool algorithmic technology behind it. Plus, I'm wearing one right now. So it's always monitoring what I'm eating. I'm always monitoring what I'm eating by what's happening with my glucose. It's very, very cool. And that link down below will get you 15% off too. So you don't have to get a prescription from your doctor. You don't have to go through it. It makes it super easy, and the tech is just awesome. So that link is down below, first line of the description. Next one is thirst. Now, this was one of the signs that I faced when about, I don't know, 11, 12 years ago when I was diagnosed with diabetes, when I was overweight. That was waking up all the time being thirsty. Now, it goes hand in hand with the same reason you pee a lot. Okay, what ends up happening is you're trying to expel this extra glucose. And if you think of it like a conveyor belt that you're throwing luggage on a conveyor belt, and there's one person to pull the luggage off on the other side. Well, if all of a sudden you throw 10,000 bags of luggage on this conveyor belt, that one person can't keep up. So it all has to get excreted. So it gets excreted into a bucket. You're peeing, right? But what ends up happening is you're pulling fluids from other tissues to create urine because you're not drinking at night. So it's pulling it from your muscles, it's pulling it from other tissue. Next thing you know, you have all these hormones, aldosterone, you have antidiuretic hormone, you have all these things telling you, hey dude, drink water, you're getting thirsty, you're losing water at a rapid rate. And your body's like, dude, I'm asleep, but it still wakes you up. Next one is a wild, wild one. It's probably one of the biggest causes of overheating at night outside of like an actual metabolic or serious condition. So if you're overheating at night, like you're waking up being like, I'm super hot, maybe your spouse is like, dude, the air conditioner is at 65 degrees, like how are you overheating? Well, there's some reasons behind it. If you have super high glucose at night, it can get so high that it can trigger an inflammatory response via what are called prostaglandins. If prostaglandins, particularly like prostaglandin E2, gets too high, it will signal histamines to release. Histamines create a feverish, clammy feeling. In fact, histamines are responsible or partially responsible for why you get so warm when you're sick. So this is a very real thing, and these histamines keep you hot because they're kind of in defense mode, and then you keep waking up because you're hot. But then there's other reasons too. When glucose goes high, insulin typically gets higher too, but if you're hyperinsulinemic, where you just have chronically high levels of insulin, well, what ends up happening is insulin ends up acting as a vasoconstrictor because of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So your limbs, like the vasoconstriction and all the blood stays concentrated in your core and makes you really hot. But then there's some newer evidence, very mechanistic, so it's too early to say with certainty, but what this data is showing is that perhaps insulin has an impact at a genetic level to influence genes that increase our body heat. So when insulin is really high, we might have an increase in the expression of sarcolipin and possibly even uncoupling protein 1, which make us more sensitive to the heat aspect of glucose. Glucose alone will create more heat in the body, but this might make it so you're more sensitive to it. So there's a number of reasons, so definitely something to keep a keen eye out for. The next one is if you're waking up in the middle of the night, you need to reach for ibuprofen because your head feels like tight or you have a headache. This is a very real thing too. And the first obvious one is the dehydration aspect. Okay, remember, you're peeing more, so you're losing water from other tissues. So you definitely can get dehydrated, and that's gonna cause an issue. But additionally, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and that vasoconstriction we talked about, the limbs, you also get vasoconstriction that happens in the brain. So you have less cerebral blood flow, and that constriction creates the headache. So what ends up happening? Well, you have less blood, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I have a pounding headache, what's going on? Now, if your glucose was lower and stable, this wouldn't be happening as much. And then the last one that sounds kind of funny, but is very real. If you really pay close attention to why you're waking up, sometimes you don't pay attention to it because you just wake up. But if you actually realize you're hungry when you wake up, this is a very real thing. The bigger the insulin spike, a lot of times in an unhealthy or metabolically unhealthy person, the bigger the drop. And this drop can signal, this glucose drop at least, can signal glucagon, the counter-regulatory hormone, which helps you burn fat, but it also makes you hungry. So although during the day it can be good because we're passively occupied and we are distracted, but at night, even before you go to bed, this could be a problem. Could be the reason why I need a midnight snack or I need to eat right before I go to bed. So pay close attention to these things. I'm serious when I say they could be early signs of a bigger problem, but I'm not your doctor. If you start to see these things, you should get some lab work done and you should investigate it. I'll see you tomorrow.